Introduction to Philosophy. The beginnings. Philosophy starts in Greece during the 6th century before Christ, with those philosophers who are nowadays known as the Presocratics, because they came before Socrates and they represent a way of thinking which faces a turning point from Socrates onward. In fact, we could say that with Socrates, the attention of the thinking mind moves from the outward to the inward. The Presocratics are also known as the naturalists. Thales. If I told you that Thales explains the origin of the world with water, and if I added that the next few philosophers would respectively choose the air, then the apeiron, and then the fire, you would very likely think that philosophers just talk nonsense and invent various things out of the imagination. But if we focus on how those philosophers came to that conclusion of the origin of the world, then we could certainly change our judgment about them. In fact, the early philosophers represent a breakup with the tradition, which explained the things of the world and the world itself using myths and fantasy. Philosophers start to use reason based on observation. Aristotle writes the following about Thales. Thales, the founder of this school of philosophy, says the permanent entity is water, which is why he also propounded that the earth floats on water. Presumably, he derived this assumption from seeing that the nutriment of everything is moist, and that the heat itself is generated from moisture and depends upon it for its existence, and that from which a thing is generated is always its first principle. He derived his assumption then from this, and also from the fact that the seeds of everything have a moist nature, whereas water is the first principle of the nature of moist things. Aristotle, Metaphysics. Thales is considered the first philosopher of Western philosophy, as he was looking for a rational answer to the question, what is the ultimate nature of our world? Using his observation, Thales is said to have concluded, we don't have written work by him, so he has concluded that matter is, although in different aspects, water, evaporating water, condensed water, or solid water. Now this explanation is not important in itself, but it needs to be seen under the light of research, which tries to conceal unity underlying the multiplicity of beings. Thales looks for a primary substance, which is also the origin of everything. Unity in difference. And this is not anymore a mythological explanation, but one based on observation and reasoning. We could play a game and try to reproduce his argument. The thesis of this game would be water is everything. Observation. Water appears in different states. When it expands, it evaporates, we have air and heat. When it contracts, we have ice and solid. We find it in a liquid state as well. When I look around, I see that things can be only solid, liquid, or gas, air. First conclusion, water is the only element that can be all of them. Water is everything. Therefore, water is in everything. Therefore, everything comes from water. This is a possible way a thinker without the body of knowledge built by our modern science and technology and without asking for divine intervention could have explained the essence of the world, of reality. What we have here is the search of a principle of unity underlying the multiplicity of the apparent world. Next slide, next philosopher that lived in that time, which is the Pre-Socratic time, is Anaximander. Anaximander is born around 610 and died in 546 before Christ. Anaximander comes from Miletus, a colony of Greece. He was a student of Thales. We owe him the first map of the world, the first star chart, the first Greek sundial, and an indoor clock. He wrote a book called On Nature. And a quote here: "We may say that he was one of the greatest minds that ever lived. By speculating and arguing about the boundless, he was the first metaphysician. By drawing a map of the world, he was the first geographer. But above all, by boldly speculating about the universe, he broke with the ancient image of the celestial vault and became the discoverer of the Western world picture." Anaximander's argument is based on the fact that in the world the elements coexist. In fact, none of them is seen to be eliminating the others. They persist in a state of balance. Therefore, none of them singularly could be the original principle of the world and the one that expresses the unity beyond the multiplicity. He concluded then that something else, which he called the apeiron, it's a Greek word, which can be translated with boundless or unbounded, is the element at the origin of all that is. Now, this argument is based on Anaximander fragments, and we can say that he is possibly the first who made use of philosophical arguments. Aristotle reports another argument that supports the thesis of Anaximander, and we can call it the theoretical interpretation argument. It goes this way: everything has an origin or is an origin. The boundless has no origin, for then it would have a limit. Moreover, it is both unborn and immortal, being a kind of origin. For that which has become has also necessarily an end, and there is a termination to every process of destruction. Physics 203 B610. Dillis Krantz 12a15. It is its logical structure that makes this argument very stringent. On the other hand, Simplicius, a philosopher of the 6th century after Christ, who wrote the commentaries on Aristotle, whose teachings he tried to reconcile with those of Plato. Those reports of those who say that it is one, moving and infinite, Anaximander, son of Praxedes, a Milesian, the successor and pupil of Thales, said that the principle and element of existing things was the apeiron, indefinite or infinite, being the first to introduce this name of the material principle. He says that it is neither water nor any other of the so-called elements, but some other apparent nature, from which come into being all the heavens and the various worlds in them. And the source of coming to be for existing things is that into which destruction too happens according to necessity, for they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice according to the assessment of time. As he describes it in these rather poetical terms, it is clear that he, seeing the changing of the four elements into each other, thought it right to make known of this the substratum, but something else besides this, and he produces coming to be not through the alteration of the element, but by the separation of the opposites through the eternal motion. Physics 24. There is another argument which is called the long since argument. Greek word ede can be translated with long since. So the long since argument is based on this word and is known as Aristotle reproduced it. This is what Aristotle says. Some make this, namely that which is additional to the elements, the boundless, but not air or water, lest the others should be destroyed by one of them, being boundless. For they are opposite to one another. The air, for instance, is cold, the water is wet, and the fire is hot. If any of them should be boundless, it would long since have destroyed the others. But now there is, they say, something other from which they are all generated. Physics 204b 2529. Now, this is not only virtually the same argument as it is used by Plato in his Phaedo, 72, A12 and B5. But even more interesting is that the same argument was used almost 2,500 years later by Friedrich Nietzsche in his attempt to prove his thesis of the eternal recurrence. I quote, "If the world had a goal, it would have been reached. If there were for it some unintended final state, this also must have been reached. If it were at all capable of opposing and becoming fixed, if it were capable of being, if the whole course of its becoming it possessed even for a moment this capability of being, then again all becoming would long since have come to an end." Okay, Nietzsche wrote these words in his notebook in 1885, Greek, which was not published during his lifetime. He mentioned the argument and credited Anaximander with it. In other words, none of the observable elements could be the first cause, because all observable elements are changeable, and were one to be more powerful than the others, it would have long since eradicated them. As observed, however, the elements of the earth seem to be in balance with each other, none of them holding the upper hand, and therefore some other source must be looked to for a first cause. In making this claim, Anaximander becomes the first known philosopher to work in abstract rather than natural philosophy, and the first metaphysician even before the term metaphysics was coined. Anaximander has also been credited with a proto-theory of evolution, as this passage attests. Anaximander said that the first living creatures were born in moisture, enclosed in thorny barks, and that as their age increased, they came forth onto the drier part. And when the bark had broken off, they lived a different kind of life for a short time. End of quote. He says further that in the beginning man was born from creatures of a different kind, because other creatures are soon self-supporting. But man alone needs prolonged nursing. For this reason, he would not have survived if this had been his original form. Okay, now I have a question for you. If you were watching a debate between Thales and Anaximander, after having heard the arguments put forward by both, which one would you accept as the most plausible and why? I could say, for example, that Anaxagoras missed the point that Thales was making. In fact, this latter said the water is in everything, therefore there wouldn't be any need to overthrow the other elements as it is present in each other. Also, we could point out that there are specific locations on Earth where one element seems to be dominant, overpowering the others. In the Sahara Desert, fire seems the ruler, or in other areas, water seems the winner. On the other hand, if we look at the Earth globally, we can actually say that all the elements are present in some kind of balance. We also could wonder, when Thales said that water is in everything, did it mean that it was also in the other elements, or he did not consider the other elements as such? Fire, for example, came to be considered as an element only much later. Anaxagoras is the third of the Presocratic philosophers, and we stop there briefly. He's credited with having theorized Big Bang theory ante litteram. The world is born from the explosion expansion of an original stuff containing everything in itself. The origin is due to a movement of rotation which produces an initial separation of the elements. Interestingly enough, Anaxagoras thinks that the expansion of the universe never stopped. Furthermore, he admits the existence of other worlds. Finally, the mind controls matter, and it is separate from it. And we stop here for the moment.